I remember the first night it happened. The hallway lights in our off-campus house flickered as though struggling against some invisible presence, and a cold draft seeped under my door, despite the unseasonably warm weather outside. Even the walls seemed to breathe, emitting soft creaks that made my heart pound. I tried to dismiss the dread gnawing at my mind, but it clung to me like a damp, suffocating cloth. Something was amiss the moment our new roommate arrived, yet I couldn't quite articulate why. An inexplicable tension settled over the house, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. I moved into this place at the start of the semester, drawn by cheap rent and its reputation as a lively spot for upperclassmen. I had grown used to the laid-back atmosphere, shared meals in the cramped kitchen, late-night study sessions in the dim living room, the occasional argument over who ate whose leftovers. Then our new freshman, Daniel, showed up. He was quiet, awkward, and introduced himself with a nervous laugh. He mentioned a brother who would sometimes visit him at night because they had, as he put it, private matters to discuss. I didn't think much of it at first. People often have unusual arrangements, especially around midterms or finals. But there was something unsettling about the way Daniel's eyes darted around as he spoke. Every hair on my arm prickled, as if warning me that his presence would unravel my sense of normalcy. Not long after Daniel's arrival, small things began to go missing. First, I noticed my toothbrush wasn't in its usual spot, instead crammed into a corner of the bathroom sink. Then a stack of my notes disappeared from the dining table, only to show up under my bed. One of my housemates, who insisted we set up a nightly watch, claimed he had seen a tall figure in a baseball cap enter Daniel's room around 2 a.m. Another insisted we check the security camera by the front door, but no visitor was logged. Our housemates grew uneasy, exchanging worried glances and murmuring their suspicions. Whenever we confronted Daniel, he seemed confused, almost hurt by our accusations, saying he had no idea where our belongings went or who kept leaving footprints in the hallway. As the nights progressed, my anxiety blossomed into fear. Every evening, around midnight, the corridor lights would flicker wildly. I couldn't explain the sudden hush that overtook the house, as though even the wind outside refused to make a sound. I swear my pulse would echo in my ears, matching the flicker of the overhead bulbs. At one point, I leaned against the wall to steady myself, only to feel the plaster tremble beneath my touch. My breath would catch in my throat, and I'd stand there, struggling against the undeniable conviction that someone was standing right behind me. One night, a friend in the next room confided, through hushed, trembling words, that he had found cryptic messages slipped beneath his door. He said the notes were signed by a name nobody recognized, consisting of jagged letters that seemed almost carved into the paper. Unsure if it was some elaborate prank, he saved one of these notes to show me. The text was a bizarre jumble of letters and symbols, all culminating in that same indecipherable signature. My mouth went dry when I touched the paper, feeling a strange warmth radiate from it. The more I stared at the shapes, the more they seemed to shift, as though trying to communicate directly with me. I became consumed with paranoia. Each night, I would sit in my room with the door locked, the glow of my desk lamp casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt like I was being watched, as if eyes were peering through the tiniest cracks. My heart would race at the slightest creak, my skin erupting in goosebumps. I began to doubt my own memory. Had I left my bag in the kitchen or in my closet? Why did the reflection in my window look distorted at times, like a long-limbed figure crouching over my shoulder, tension knotted in my stomach, and I'd break into a cold sweat whenever I imagined Daniel's brother creeping through the house. The final straw came when I discovered one of those cryptic notes under my door. It whispered that I should mind my own business, that certain ties of blood ran deeper than logic or reason. My vision blurred with shock. Suddenly I could barely catch my breath, and my hands trembled so violently that the note fluttered away. A chill settled into my bones, as if the temperature in the room had plummeted. Gathering enough courage to confront Daniel, I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table, gazing blankly at a wall. When I mentioned the note, he insisted he had no idea what I was talking about and reminded me that his brother was simply paying occasional visits. Yet he refused to explain why no one else ever met this brother, or why all our security logs showed no evidence of him coming or going. My determination to uncover the truth overshadowed any common sense I had left. I started staying awake to watch the corridor from a crack in my door. Each night, I battled exhaustion, my eyes stinging from the effort of staring into the dim light. At around 3 a.m., I finally witnessed a shadow, tall, impossibly thin, glide down the hall. It seemed to hover rather than walk. My throat tightened when it paused in front of Daniel's door. Its head turned as if it sensed my gaze, and the silhouette of a baseball cap came into sharp focus. Despite every muscle screaming for me to hide, I froze, paralyzed by that faceless shape. Then it slipped into Daniel's room without a sound. A week later, I found a new note waiting for me, jammed under the door so forcefully that the paper had torn. The message instructed me to keep away from the locked storage closet in the basement, suggesting I would regret discovering what lay inside. By now, I felt my sanity fraying. My nights blurred into a continuous, restless haze. I dreamed of that figure drifting around the house, passing through walls to lurk behind me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering, convinced I heard the faint scraping of nails just outside my bedroom door. Desperation drove me to investigate the forbidden storage closet. During a late afternoon, I walked down the narrow basement steps, guided only by my phone's flashlight. My breath echoed in the cramped space, and the air reeked of old, decaying wood. As I reached the closet, my hand trembled on the doorknob. Inside, I found a pile of old letters, all signed in the same jagged script as the cryptic notes. They mentioned Daniel by name, along with references to a brother who existed only in the margin between dreams and reality. My stomach lurched with fear, and I felt a prickling heat at the back of my neck. The shadows seemed alive, as if they pulsed with the energy of something ancient and hungry. My world tilted, and I rushed out of the basement, heart pounding so fiercely that I feared I might pass out. Upstairs, I confronted Daniel, only to find his room empty, though I still heard his voice murmuring inside. I had the terrible impression he was talking to someone unseen, responding to an entity that stood just beyond my line of sight. A surge of revulsion swept through me, and I fled, grabbing my coat and leaving the house without a backward glance. I stayed away for a couple of days, finding refuge at a friend's apartment. When I finally returned, intent on packing my belongings, I discovered Daniel's room vacant. The lights in the hallway had grown strangely dim, and an oppressive silence weighed down the air. On the floor was a single piece of paper bearing that same signature. It contained a final warning that I had only delayed the inevitable by leaving. My hands trembled as I stuffed the note into my pocket, ignoring the prickly sensation against my skin. By then, I felt sure that whatever presence had invaded our home was not just Daniel's secret, It was something that clung to him, or perhaps it used him as a conduit. I had no choice but to gather my things and leave that night. Even as I stepped out the front door, I sensed the house itself breathing behind me, vibrating with an unnatural current. My muscles tensed, and the hair on my neck stood on end, but I did not look back. I wish I could say that leaving solved everything, but those cryptic messages occasionally appear in my mailbox, always hinting that the silhouette has not forgotten me. Some nights, I startle awake, convinced I see a tall figure with a cap lingering in the corner of my bedroom. My pulse races, and sweat soaks my sheets as I scramble for the light. There's never anyone there, yet the fear grips me all the same. Even now, I catch glimpses of movement in dark hallways and feel a prickle of dread in silent rooms. I escaped that house, but I'm haunted by the thought that the entity I saw was never bound by mere walls or doors. It follows me in the quiet moments, a living shadow that reminds me some things will never let go. I remember the night clouds rolling in over the fields, pregnant with an unspoken threat, as if the land itself braced for something it could not name. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves reached me before the last traces of daylight disappeared, and I felt an unsettling chill crawl down my spine. It was not cold, not truly, but the air had a strange weight to it. Even the wind seemed cautious, whispering through the tall grass with a hushed warning. I could not shake the notion that I was being observed from somewhere beyond the tree line, and that this silent scrutiny had already been going on for far too long. When my nieces, 2 sisters, both grown, arrived for their vacation at my farm, I did my best to hide any apprehension. I showed them around, pointing out the barn, the chicken coop, and the orchard. I tried to appear calm and welcoming, though the knot in my stomach grew tighter every time I glanced toward that desolate patch near the property's edge. They noticed it soon enough, a fenced square of land where nothing sprouted, not even weeds, the soil cracked and gray. I could see the questions forming in their eyes. They asked about it indirectly, but I deflected, claiming it was just poor soil or leftover from an old project. Still, I felt their curiosity flaring. At dusk, I heard them rummaging for lanterns, my chest constricted with a sudden wave of anxiety, my heart rattling against my ribs, as if warning me to intervene. I paced by the window, glancing outside to see faint beams of light bobbing across the yard. Sweat built on my forehead, cold and persistent, as I tried to decide whether I should stop them. Yet something held me back, a leaden dread that froze my voice in my throat. Eventually, I sank into a chair, every sense on alert, listening for any sound that might signal their return. When they came back, their eyes were wide, and their voices were hushed. They described a hunched figure prowling around the patch, something that stood just beyond the fence line. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. They said it had no discernible features, only a smooth, pale surface where a face should have been. My nieces insisted it moved with a jerkiness that was almost insect-like, its limbs bending at wrong angles. I tried to downplay their fear, offering a half-hearted explanation about an odd reflection or a trick of the moonlight. But I knew my own face must have gone white as chalk, betraying my own terror. I had hoped ignoring it would ease the tension. Instead, the next day brought new signs. A torn scrap of cloth snagged on the barbed wire fence, fluttering in the mild breeze. No footprints, no tracks in the dust, just that ragged piece of fabric, dark and stiff, as if it had been out in the elements for decades. My nieces quietly mentioned hearing a low moan, a muffled sobbing sound, when they stood near the fence. It seemed to seep from beneath the soil, as though something was trapped down there. They said the wind carried it across the fields, but only when they were standing right next to the fence. I broke into a cold sweat, my lungs constricting. I wanted to tell them to stay away, but the words felt heavy in my mouth, stuck behind a growing sense of foreboding. Each night, they tried again to see if the figure would return. I lay awake in my bed, heart pounding so hard I thought it would split my chest. When I managed to drift off, I dreamed of that empty patch of land. In those dreams, the earth pulsed like a heartbeat, and I sensed a presence watching me from beneath the dirt. I could hear it whispering. Upon waking, I couldn't recall the exact words, but I remembered the feeling. It was sorrow laced with anger, and it made my hands tremble whenever I thought of it. On the third night, the moaning grew louder. It was no longer a faint whimper lost in the breeze. It carried a desperate edge, filling the silence of the farmland with a dreadful lament. My vision swam, and I found myself questioning my own perceptions. Could the soil itself cry out? Was I becoming unhinged? My nieces reported the same experiences, though they spoke of it more cautiously. They noticed my hands shaking whenever they brought up the subject. They asked if I knew anything about the land's history. I responded with half-truths, implying that it had been left alone for a reason, though I avoided any specifics. I felt my heart slam against my ribs every time they pressed me for details. One afternoon, I approached the fence alone, determined to confront whatever hid there. The stillness was eerie. The fence posts stood like silent sentinels, and the wire seemed to hum in the hush. As I leaned over, the smell of damp earth rose up, carrying a faint stench of decay. My breathing grew labored. Sweat trickled down my temples. A sudden wave of nausea hit me, and I nearly fell forward onto the barren ground. That was when I heard it clearly. A soft, choking sob that reverberated through the soil. It made my blood run cold. My muscles seized, and for an agonizing moment, I could not move or even blink. My vision blurred at the edges, and the world tilted in an odd, disorienting swirl. I could swear the ground moved, rippling as if something beneath it was trying to break free. Panic surged through my veins, setting my heart racing faster than I thought possible. My fingers gripped the fence wire so tightly that I felt it cutting into my skin. In my peripheral vision, I caught a glimpse of that shape again. The same contorted figure hunched among the fence posts. It seemed to hover in the corner of my sight, dissolving whenever I tried to focus on it directly. Its faceless head cocked to one side, as though it was studying me. My throat went dry, and my entire body trembled with a mixture of dread and something close to pity. I realized then that whatever haunted this place was not simply a ghost or a monster. It was a profound anguish that had taken on physical form. Yet understanding did little to quell my fear. I staggered backward, nearly falling over my own feet, and ran inside with my heart pounding like war drums. That night, I gathered my nieces and told them we had to leave the fenced area alone. I insisted it was dangerous, and they seemed to sense the gravity in my voice. Still, I caught them exchanging anxious glances, as though they knew I was withholding answers. My nightmares worsened, the sobbing intensifying in my mind. In the shadowy corners of my room, I sensed movement. Floorboards creaked with no one there. Each time I tried to steady my breathing, a new wave of dread would shiver down my spine. By the final evening of their stay, I could no longer bear the oppressive weight of that place. I ventured outside alone, lantern in hand, determined to confront it, or perhaps beg it to stop. The wind whipped across the open field, rattling the fence, and I saw the figure again by the boundary. It stood perfectly still, arms dangling at its sides, head tilted in silent observation. My breath caught in my throat. A part of me wanted to walk closer, to see if it would speak or vanish. But my courage faltered. I understood, on some raw, visceral level, that I stood in the presence of something beyond my understanding. Suddenly, the ground let out a long, mournful moan, as though exhaling all its buried sorrow in one heaving breath. The fence shook violently. I dropped the lantern and scrambled away, chest tight with terror. I did not look back until I reached the safety of my porch. When I turned, the figure was gone, yet the fence continued to sway, even though the wind had died. I left the farm a few days later, making excuses about urgent business elsewhere. My nieces joined me without complaint. The memory of that empty patch of earth still clings to me with a suffocating grip, replaying in my mind whenever I close my eyes. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I recall that faceless form and feel an echo of its grief tremble through my bones, and I cannot help but wonder if it still stands there by the fence, trapped in an eternal vigil of pain and longing, waiting for someone foolish enough to draw near. I still feel the chill on my skin whenever I recall that day at sea, as if my body refuses to let go of the cold sweat and trembling heartbeats that seized me. From the moment I stepped on the deck, I sensed something was wrong. The air tasted heavier than usual, and the morning sun cast a glare too bright to be comforting. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. My friends, though reluctant to admit it, showed small signs of unease, a flexed jaw here, a nervous glance there. Looking back, I wonder if we should have taken those warnings to heart. But we were eager amateurs chasing adventure and fish, and nothing else mattered. I had bought that little boat a month earlier, proud to finally call myself a captain, even if only in name. The vessel was modest, white hull, a tiny cabin, and just enough room for 4 of us to fish comfortably. On that day, the water looked calm, promising a gentle ride. We loaded our gear, checked the weather forecast, and set off with the naive excitement that comes from not knowing what truly lurks beneath the surface. The first few hours were ordinary enough. We chatted in subdued tones about the catch we hoped to land, our voices blending with the steady hum of the engine. Every now and then, I glanced at the sky. Thin clouds wandered lazily above us, yet something about their slow drifting made me uneasy. I tried to ignore the goosebumps crawling up my arms, reminding myself it was probably just nerves. It was just past midday when the radio crackled. I remember freezing for a split second as a burst of static erupted from the speaker. There was a voice, or maybe multiple voices, impossible to tell, speaking in a language none of us recognized. The sounds were garbled, each syllable drawn out in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand upright. One of my friends called over, asking if I had tuned to a strange frequency by mistake. I replied I hadn't touched the dial since we left the dock. Someone muttered a suggestion that we switch off the radio. I agreed. No more than 15 minutes later, the wind shifted. Clouds coalesced, almost like they were converging on our position. The once gentle breeze became a howling gust that rattled the overhead rods, sending a jolt of fear through me. My palms turned clammy. My heart hammered faster, and I had to steady my breathing just to keep control of my thoughts. Then came the thunder, low and deep, reverberating inside my skull until it felt like my teeth might crack from the vibration. We found ourselves in the middle of a storm that no forecast had predicted. Lightning slashed the sky in blinding forks, and the rain hit us in waves so dense that seeing beyond the bow became nearly impossible. I tried to navigate by the compass, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to find north. My throat went dry, and my lungs burned from rapid, shallow breaths. I remember gripping the helm so tightly that my knuckles whitened. My friends gathered around me, and I caught bits of their panicked remarks as they asked what was happening. I could only shake my head, my mouth too parched to form coherent words. Through the roar of the wind and rain, a chorus of whispers broke through, slipping under the thunder's growl. They sounded close, too close, as though spoken right beside my ear. My entire body tensed. The whispers warned us not to come back. I felt my chest tighten, and adrenaline spiked in my veins, forcing my heart to beat erratically. When I glanced at my friends, they wore the same expression of dread, confirming that I wasn't the only one hearing those voices. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but it might have been just minutes. At one point, the boat rocked so violently that I lost my footing and slammed my shoulder against the wall of the cockpit. Pain shot through me, but I barely registered it over the cacophony of my own terror. Rainwater streamed down my face, mixing with sweat and the faint taste of salt that clung to my lips. The swirling darkness of the clouds seemed alive, as though it had a will of its own, pushing us farther from safety. When at last the storm broke, the sky opened just enough to reveal a path of leaden gray light toward the coastline. The radio remained silent, and the compass still refused to settle. I pressed on the throttle, desperate to find land. Every second that passed, I felt more certain that some unseen presence was following us. I could sense a prickle at the back of my neck, as though invisible eyes were locked on me. My stomach churned, not from seasickness, but from a deeper dread that wouldn't let go. The moment we spotted the harbor, relief washed over me, yet it was tainted by an overwhelming sense of doom. The docks looked normal from a distance, but the air felt stale, as though we were entering a place we no longer belonged. After we tied up, I was the first to hop onto the pier, my legs trembling from fear and exhaustion. My friends joined me with expressions that hovered between weary and haunted. We exchanged a few quiet words, mostly asking if everyone was all right. Nobody had any real answers, and nobody could explain the radio transmissions or the strange voices. It wasn't until we inspected the boat's hull that true horror set in. Deep, jagged scratches ran along the keel, as if some massive creature had dragged its claws across the fiberglass. The cuts were too big to be from rocks, and we had been in open water anyway. One friend tried to rationalize, saying perhaps we had scraped something submerged, but his voice faltered as he examined the symmetrical lines. I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling the raw edges of the damaged surface. My hand shook so badly that I had to pull away, a surge of nausea turning my stomach. Even now, when I think about those marks, a wave of dizziness passes through me. I'll never forget the hushed panic in all of us as we stood there, speechless. No one had any explanation. We had left in calm waters and returned battered by a storm that appeared and vanished without warning. The radio's bizarre messages still echo in my dreams, a faint chant in a tongue I can't place. On quiet nights, I find myself listening for whispers in the wind, half expecting them to tell me I should never have come back. My heart races each time I recall that moment on the deck, the thunder rumbling, and the needle spinning uselessly. I wish I could say I found peace after returning home, but that would be a lie. Every time I see the horizon, I feel a pulse of terror in my chest. My hands sweat at the memory of those claw-like scratches beneath my feet. Something out there called to us that day, and although we escaped the tempest, I'm not certain we truly returned. In the silence of my own thoughts, I can still hear those warnings carried on the wind, a final reminder that some mysteries of the sea remain unspoken, lurking just beyond the line where sky and water meet, and they are waiting